The first time I saw her, she had a rifle leveled at my chest, and behind me on a lead line stood 7 horses I'd taken back that morning from the men who stole them. I'd been riding 3 days on a hunch and a set of tracks, and I was tired down to the marrow of my bones. And now here was a woman standing in the willow shade where Painted Creek bent south, holding an old Spencer steady as a fence post, looking at me the way you'd look at a wolf that wandered into your dooryard. "Those are mine," she said. Her English was plain and quick, no accent I could lay a name to except her own. "You'll set them loose and ride out, or I'll put a hole in you." I kept my hands where she could see them. The 7 head behind me shifted and blew, restless from the days on the run, and I felt them want to go to her, felt the pull of it down the rope. That told me more than anything she could have said. A horse knows its own people. "I expect they are yours," I said. "I found them up at the Bitter Springs Trail with 3 men running them north to sell. I didn't much care for how those men were running them, so I took them back." "You took them?" "From the men who took them from you. There's a difference, though I'll grant you it don't look like much from where you're standing." She didn't lower the rifle. Up close she was younger than her steadiness made her seem, maybe my own age, with a long scar healed white along the back of one hand and eyes that didn't blink when they ought to have. There was a quirt looped at her wrist and a string of trade beads at her throat, and a way of standing that said she'd faced down worse than a saddle tramp before breakfast. "Men like you don't bring horses back," she said. "Men like you bring more men later to take what's left." "I'm not partial to being called a kind of man before I've said 10 words, I told her. "I'm one man, I'm hungry, and I'm holding a rope I'd just as soon hand to you and be gone." For a long moment the creek talked to itself, and the willows turned their leaves over in the little wind, and she studied me the way the horse trader at Bonner's Ford studied my own gelding's teeth, reading what I was worth and finding it doubtful. Then she whistled one short note, sharp as a struck flint, and the lead mare behind me threw up her head and answered, and the woman lowered the rifle an inch. "Drop the rope," she said. I dropped it. The mare walked past me to her, and the others followed, and the woman ran her free hand down the mare's neck without ever taking her eyes off me, and I saw the animal lean into her touch like a child into its mother's skirt, and something in my chest that had been clenched up tight for the better part of 4 years eased a hair without my leave. "You're bleeding," she said. I looked down. One of the stolen-back horses had clipped my forearm with a hoof in the dark when I cut the picket line, and I'd forgotten it. The sleeve was stiff with it. "It'll keep," I said. "It'll fester," she said, in the flat way you'd correct a fool, and that was the first time I heard Naya tell me I was wrong about something. It was not the last. I should say who I was, so you'll understand why a woman holding 7 horses by a creek mattered to a man who'd sworn off mattering. My name is Eli Renner. I rode for the Union as a scout through the worst of the war, which means I spent 4 years finding men so other men could kill them, and reading ground so columns could march over it, and being good at a thing I came to hate the way you hate a smell that won't wash out. When it was finished, I didn't go home. There wasn't much home to go to, and what there was had grown around the hole where I used to be. So I drifted west, the way a lot of us drifted, looking for country empty enough to forget in. I found the Painted Creek basin in the spring of that year, a broad green bottomland running down out of the Stoneback Hills, with grass to a horse's belly and cottonwoods along the water, and the kind of quiet that gets into a man and softens him without his noticing. I took on at the livery in Bonner's Ford breaking horses for wages, because breaking horses was the one thing the war had left me that didn't taste of ash. I had a gift for it. My mother used to say I'd been born talking the language and just had to learn the human one later and learn it poorly. I could gentle a spoiled outlaw colt that 3 other men had given up on, and I did it quiet, no quirt, no spur, no breaking the spirit to ride the body. Folks thought it was witchcraft. It wasn't. It was only patience, which is the cheapest thing in the world and the one nobody wants to spend. What I knew of the people who'd been in that country before any of us came I'd learned the wrong way, in the war's edges and the army's company, and most of it was lies and the rest was worse. I'll own that. I came into the basin thinking I knew a thing I did not know at all. The band camped along the upper bend of Painted Creek, below the Stoneback Hills, maybe 40 lodges in a good season, fewer now. They traded at Bonner's Ford as long as there'd been a Bonner's Ford, hides and horses, and worked leather for powder and iron and coffee, and they had a paper from a treaty that said the Bottomland Creek was theirs to keep, which the men who wrote the paper had already half forgotten, and the men who came after meant to forget entirely. The man who meant to forget it hardest was Harlan Mercer. I knew Mercer's name before I ever knew his face. You couldn't be a week in Bonner's Ford without knowing it. He ran the Box M, the biggest spread in the basin, 4,000 head if he had one, and he'd built it fast, too fast, men said, though they said it low and looked over their shoulders when they did. He had the storekeeper in his debt and the freight contract in his pocket and a foreman named Del Coy who smiled at you while his eyes took your measure for a grave. Mercer wanted the Painted Creek bottomland the way a thirsty man wants water, because that's exactly what it was, the best year-round water in 40 miles, and his herd had grown past what his own range could carry. So Mercer had started in on the band the slow way first. He ran a few of their horses off and called it strays. He had his men cut a wing dam upstream and turn a good share of the creek into a ditch that watered Box M grass and left the band's bottomland running thin. He went to the Indian agent, a soft, frightened man named Prout who'd have signed his own mother away to be left alone, and he talked about how the band was a danger, how they ought to be moved to the reservation lands out east where the government wanted all of them anyway, how it'd be a mercy really, and a kindness, and good for everyone. He used those words. I heard him use them later to my face. The 7 horses I'd taken back from the Bitter Springs trail had been Mercer's doing, though I didn't know it that first morning by the creek. His men had lifted them and were running them north to a buyer who didn't ask questions, the way they'd lifted a dozen others that spring, bleeding the band's herd a few head at a time so that come the hard winter the people would be poorer and weaker, and easier to push off the land Mercer wanted. It was a patient kind of cruelty, and I've come to believe the patient kind is the worst, because it means a man has sat down and thought about it. I learned all this in pieces over that summer. The first piece I learned was the woman by the creek, and her name, and that her name was the only thing about her she gave away cheap. She did not invite me to the camp. I want to be clear about that because the story gets told otherwise sometimes, made softer than it was, and the soft version cheats her. She owed me nothing. I brought back what was already hers, which is not a gift, only the absence of a theft, and she knew the difference better than I did. What happened was she looked at my bleeding arm and made her flat correction, and then she said, "Ride to the ford the long way by the cottonwoods. Don't come up the creek." And she turned and took her horses up the bottom toward the camp without another word, and I sat my gelding and watched her go and felt foolish and dismissed, and underneath both, lighter than I'd felt in a long while, though I couldn't have told you why. I doctored the arm myself at the livery, and it festered anyway, just as she'd said it would, and for 3 days I rode the broncs with my left hand swelled up like a bread loaf and my temper short. On the 4th morning a boy from the camp came down to the livery, 12 or 13, on a paint pony, watchful as a hawk, and without dismounting he held out a small parfleche pouch and said, "Naya says put this on it. She says you are too stupid to do it yourself." Then he wheeled the pony and was gone before I could say a word. Inside the pouch was a paste of something green and bitter-smelling. I put it on the arm because I'd run out of better ideas, and the swelling was down by night and gone by the 3rd day, the wound knitting clean. I have it still, the scar, I mean, a pale comma on the inside of my forearm, and I have never in my life been able to look at it without seeing a woman with a rifle and a boy on a paint pony calling me stupid on her behalf. That's how it started, not with a rescue, with a woman who didn't want me dead of my own foolishness because that would have been a waste, and a man too proud and too lonesome to leave it there. But I started going up the creek. The long way at first, like she'd told me, and not to the camp, only to a place a half-mile below it where the band kept a rope corral of green horses, colts and a couple of spoiled older animals nobody could do anything with. I'd seen the corral from the trail. I came one evening with no excuse and no welcome and stood at the rope and watched, and after a while Naya came down from the camp and stood at the other side of the corral and watched me watch. There was a buckskin gelding in there that had been ruined by somebody, handled wrong, scared bad, so that he'd strike and bite and wouldn't let a soul near his offside. The band valued him for his bottom and his speed and had near given up on his mind. I'd seen 100 like him in the army. Horses broke the army way, with the spirit beaten down till the body would carry a man but the heart had gone somewhere else and never come back. I hated to see it. It was the one cruelty I'd never made peace with, even in a war full of them. "You're going to tell me you can fix that one," Naya said across the corral. "I'm going to tell you nobody fixes a horse," I said. "You let him fix himself. You just stop being one more thing he's scared of." She didn't answer, but she didn't tell me to leave either, and I took that for the only invitation I was going to get, and I climbed through the rope. I'll spare you the long of it. It took 11 evenings. I never carried a rope into that corral or a thing in my hand he could fear. I let him come to me when he chose and leave when he chose and learn over and over that nothing happened when he stayed, which to a scared horse is the most astonishing thing in the world. On the 11th evening he put his nose in my hand and let me run my palm down his offside, the whole length of him, the side no man had touched without blood since God knew when, and he stood for it and breathed out long and slow, and I heard, behind me at the rope, Naya let out a breath of her own that she'd been holding maybe as long as the horse had. I turned around. She was looking at the buckskin, not at me, but her face had opened in a way I hadn't seen, and there was wet at the corner of her eye that she'd have died before admitting to. "My brother gentled that horse the first time," she said, "2 summers back. He was good with them, better than me, though I never told him so." She stopped. "Mercer's men ran him off a bluff above the Wing Dam last spring chasing our horses. My brother, they said it was an accident. They said the horse spooked." She finally looked at me. "He didn't gentle that horse just to have a white man's hands be the last ones it trusted." I didn't say I was sorry. Sorry is a small coin, and she'd been handed plenty of it by men who'd then done nothing. Instead I said, "Then I'll teach you what I did, and your hands'll be the ones it trusts, and mine can go to hell." For the first time since the rifle, she almost smiled. Almost. It was like watching a door open the width of a knife blade in a wall you'd thought was solid. "You curse a great deal for a man who is so careful with horses," she said. "Horses never gave me reason," I said. "Men have." But after that I came up the creek without the long way, and nobody stopped me, though I was watched, and I knew I was watched, and I made sure to be the kind of man worth watching for the right reasons. I worked the green horses and Naya worked beside me, and I taught her the things I knew, and she taught me a great many more. That I'd been hard with my legs and didn't know it, that I talked too much, and the horses heard the noise of me before the sense, that her people had been gentling horses on that ground since before my people had a word for the country. She was right every time. It got so I looked forward to being told I was wrong, which is not a thing a proud man says lightly. I met her father that month, Heavy Cloud, the band's headman, an old man with a face like a dry creek and a stillness that made my own seem like fidgeting. He did not like me. He had no reason to and 100 reasons not to, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. The first time Naya brought me to him, he looked at me a long while and then said something to her in their own tongue, and she answered short, and he grunted and turned away, and that was the whole of it. "What did he say?" I asked her after. "He said a man who comes around a fire he didn't build wants something from it," she said. "I told him you wanted to be near the horses." She paused. "He said horses were not the only thing near the horses." I felt my face go hot, which at my age was a humiliation all its own. "And what did you say to that?" I asked. "I told him you were too stupid to know what you wanted," she said, and walked off, and left me standing there knowing she just lied to her father to spare us both, and not knowing what to do with how that landed in me. But Mercer noticed me before I noticed him. A man like that has eyes everywhere, in the store, in the livery, in the saloon where the talk pools up at the end of a day. Word got to him that the new horsebreaker was spending his evenings up the Painted Creek bottom, thick with the band. And one afternoon his foreman Del Coy came to the livery while I was working a colt and leaned on the corral rail and smiled his graveyard smile. "Mr. Mercer'd like a word," Coy said. "Tonight. Up at the Box M, he's a generous man with his table and a man worth knowing in this country. Be a shame for a newcomer to get crosswise of him out of plain ignorance." I'd known 100 Del Coys in the war, the kind that does the dirty work and tells himself he's just following the wage. I finished the colt and washed up and rode out to the Box M because I wanted the measure of the man behind it. And there are things you can't learn about a man except across his own table. Mercer's house was the biggest in the basin, raw lumber freighted in at a cost that told you everything. And Mercer himself was big the way the house was big, broad, hearty, a hand that swallowed yours and a laugh that wanted you to think you were friends already. He fed me beef and good whiskey and talked about the country, about the future of it, about railroads coming and the price of cattle and the great civilizing tide of it all. And he said the word mercy 4 times before the plates were cleared, and every time he said it I liked him less. "I'll come to it plain, Renner," he said at last, leaning back, "because I hear you're a plain man and I respect that. You're spending your evenings with the Painted Creek bunch." "I'm gentling horses," I said. "Sure you are." The smile didn't move, but something behind it did. "Renner, those people are finished. I don't say it cruel. I say it the way you'd say winter's coming. The government wants them east on the reservation where they'll be fed and looked after, and it's going to happen whether anybody likes it or not, and it'll be a sight kinder if it happens before the snow than after. I'm only helping it along, and the man who helps it along, well," he spread his big hands. "There's bottom land in this basin going to come open. Good land. A man who'd been a friend to the right people might find himself set up handsome on it. You follow me." I followed him fine. He was offering me a piece of stolen ground to look the other way while he stole it. "That land's got a treaty on it," I said. "Treaties?" He chuckled and reached for the whiskey. "Renner, I've got more lawyers than that band's got horses, and the agent eats out of my hand, and the army that enforce a treaty is 600 miles east counting buttons. Out here a treaty's a piece of paper, and paper burns." He poured. "You're a smart man. Don't be on the wrong side of a thing that's already decided." I stood up. I left the whiskey he'd poured sitting full on the table, which I've found is a thing a certain kind of man can't abide and never forgets. "It's decided," I said, "right up until it isn't. Thank you for the beef." I rode out under a sky full of stars, and somewhere behind me in that big raw house Harlan Mercer was deciding I was a problem, and I knew it, and I found I didn't much care. The war had burned the fear of men like Mercer out of me along with most everything else. It had left me about empty, but riding home along the dark creek that night, with the water talking and the cottonwoods black against the stars and a woman's flat voice in my head telling me I was stupid, I understood for the first time in 4 years that I wasn't empty anymore. Something had moved into the hole. I didn't have a name for it yet. I would, before the summer was out. But the trouble started in earnest with the Wing Dam. That ditch Mercer's men had cut upstream had been stealing the band's water all spring, but Painted Creek ran high with the snowmelt, and there'd been enough to go around. As the summer dried, there wasn't. The bottomland grass started to brown. The garden plots the band's women kept along the lower bend went thin. And one morning Naya came down to the corral white around the mouth and said the children at the camp had started to take sick, a flux. from the low foul water that pooled where the creek used to run clean and full, and 2 of the old ones were down with it, and they needed the creek back, all of it, and they needed it now. That dam's on land that's deeded to Mercer, I said. Cutting it's a hanging matter the way he'll tell it. My people are sick on land that's deeded to us, she said, and nobody hangs Mercer for that. Her eyes were hard. I didn't come for your law, Eli. I came because you know the country and you know his men. I'm going up to break that dam tonight with whoever'll ride with me, and I wanted to know whether you'd point me at the easy way or stand in front of me like a white man. I want to tell you I had some noble speech ready. I didn't. What I said was, you'll want to go at it from the north bank below the cut, where the bank's soft. And you'll want me along, because Coy keeps a man on that dam after dark and I know how he stands his watch. She looked at me for a long moment, the way she had that first morning by the creek, reading my worth. Whatever she read, she nodded once. Bring no gun you mean to use, she said. If there's killing, it's a war, and a war we lose. We're breaking a dam, not starting one. I haven't meant to use a gun in 4 years, I said, and it was the truest thing I'd told anybody since I came into that country. We went up in the dark, Naya and myself, the boy on the paint pony whose name was Mart and who was older and harder than his years, and 3 of the band's young men who watched me the whole way with flat, unfriendly eyes that I'd have watched me with too. The night was warm and the creek smelled wrong, and we left the horses below and went up the soft north bank on foot. Coy's man was where I knew he'd be, drowsing against the dam's brush wing with a bottle, and we came on him from the dark and Naya was over him before he'd got the bottle down, her knife at his throat and her hand over his mouth, and she leaned down close and said in his ear in English, soft as you talk to a spooked horse, "You'll lie still and live or you'll move and you won't. It's the easiest choice you'll make all year." He lay still. We tied him and gagged him gentle and set him off in the brush where he'd take no harm, and then we went at the dam. It was wicked work, all mud and brush and water, and we tore at it with our hands and a couple of grub hoes the band's men had brought, and along about the middle of the night, a great section let go all at once with a sound like a sigh, and the creek came down the old channel in a brown surge that near took Martin off his feet, and I caught him by the collar and hauled him up the bank, and we stood there, all of us soaked to the chest and laughing, even me, even the young men who hated me. The whole crew of us laughing like fools in the dark, and watched Painted Creek run home down its own bottom for the first time since spring. Naya stood beside me, breathing hard, water running off her, and in the starlight her face was wide open the way it had been at the buckskin's gentling, and she looked at me and didn't bother to hide it this time. "You came," she said. "I came," I said. "A man who comes," she said, half to herself, and didn't finish it, and I understood she was answering something her father had said, working out some long arithmetic of her own. Then she shook the water off and was the band's hard speaker again. "Mercer will know by sunup. Get your horses. Whatever happens, you weren't here. You're the white horsebreaker at the ford and you don't know us." "That's a poor lie," I said. "I'm not much good at it." "Then learn," she said. "Because if they hang anyone for this dam, it'll be one of us, and it can't be you they hang for it, or we lose the one white man in this basin who's worth a damn." She caught herself having said it, and her chin came up, daring me to make anything of it. "Don't look at me like that. The horses, Eli." "I got the horses." Mercer knew by sunup, just like she said. He came down to Bonner's Ford that very morning, him and Coy and a half-dozen riders, and he stood his big self in the middle of the street and made a speech about lawlessness and savagery and the safety of decent people, and he had the words half the town wanting to believe because half the town owed him money. He swore he'd see the men who broke his lawful dam in the territorial jail or in the ground. And he looked, while he said it, straight at me where I stood in the livery door, so I'd know he knew, even if he couldn't prove it. Then the agent, Prout, scuttled out wringing his hands, and Mercer put an arm around the little man's shoulders, friendly as a snake, and steered him aside, and I knew what was being said, that this proved it, that the band was dangerous, that they had to be moved, and the sooner the better before there was real bloodshed. By noon the talk in the fort had turned. By evening men were saying it'd be a mercy to move those people, for their own good before things got worse. Mercer had taken his own theft and turned it into the band's crime, the way I'd seen generals turn a slaughter into a glorious advance. It's the oldest trick there is, and it works every time, because most folks would rather believe a comfortable lie than a hard truth that asks something of them. I went to find Naya that night sick with it, sure the whole thing had turned against us, and I found her not afraid at all. That was the thing about her I came to lean on like a wall. She did not waste herself on fear. "He's stronger than us with words," she said. "We won't beat him with words. We have to make a true thing so plain even the men who owe him money can't pretend they don't see it." "And how do we do that?" I said. She looked at me. "You said you found our 7 horses on the Bitter Springs Trail with 3 men running them north to a buyer who asks no questions." "I did." "Mercer's men, his buyer, that's how he's bled our herd all spring and not just ours." She leaned forward. "Eli, Coy's man last night before we gagged him, he was talking, begging. He said, 'Don't kill me, I only do what Mercer says, the rebrands, all of it, the rebrands. You know what that means?'" I did. A man rebrands stock when the stock isn't his. Mercer hadn't just been stealing the band's horses. A spread that grown as fast as the box M, too fast, with men muttering about it behind their hands. A spread like that grows on other men's cattle, with a running iron and a buyer who asks no questions. And not just Indian stock either. White ranchers' stock. The little outfits Mercer wanted gone as bad as he wanted the band gone. And the band's crime, the broken dam, the whole town wanted to believe in. But the theft of a white rancher's beeves, that they could not pretend away, that touched them where they lived. "If we can show it," I said slowly, "show the rebrands, the doctored stock, the buyer up north, Mercer's whole hold in this basin is built on stolen cattle, and the Cattlemen's Association will turn on him like dogs, and the agent won't dare move you while there's a marshal coming for the man who wanted you moved." "Then we show it," Naya said. We had 2 weeks, near enough, before the date Mercer had got Prout to set for the band's removal. A column of soldiers, eventually, though the soldiers were slow and far, and that was the one thing in our favor. 2 weeks to prove a thing the whole country half wanted not to be true. We worked it like I used to work the ground in the war, careful and patient and from the edges in. Martin and 2 of the young men, who could ride that country in the dark like the dark was theirs, watched the box M's far north pasture where Mercer held the doctored stock before the buyer came, and they brought me back what they saw, brands blotted and run together. The box M laid clumsy over a rocking R that belonged to a little outfit east of the Stoneback Hills. Over a bar S, over half a dozen others. Naya, who could go places I couldn't because the men of the basin didn't credit a woman with eyes, sat the back of the store and the freight office and listened, and learned the buyer's name, and the day he was due, and the bank in the territorial seat where Mercer kept the money the stolen beef made. And I rode east to the little outfits Mercer had been bleeding, the rocking R, the bar S, men I'd never met who looked at me hard when I came up their lanes, and I told them plain what I'd seen and where, and I watched their faces go from doubt to fury as they understood that the stock they'd cussed the band for losing had been lifted by the very man who'd been telling them to fear the band. It was the rocking R man, a hard old widower named Tom Ash, who said the thing that turned it. He spat in the dust of his own yard and said, "I've been giving that son of a bitch my vote at the association and my note at the bank and my back to lean a rifle on against those Painted Creek people, and the whole time he's been the one lifting my stock and pointing me at them." He looked at me. "You'll testify to what you seen." "In front of God and the territorial marshal both," I said. "Then so will I," said Tom Ash. "And so will every man Mercer's robbed, and we'll see who gets moved off this basin." "I'd be lying if I told you it went clean from there. It didn't. Mercer was no fool, and a cornered man with everything to lose is the most dangerous animal God ever made. He learned somebody was asking questions. A man like that always learns. And 3 nights before the buyer was due, his men came down on the band's camp in the dark to do what they'd been doing all spring, only harder. They came to run off horses and burn lodges and make it look by morning like the savage trouble Mercer kept promising. So the soldiers would come quicker and angrier, and the question of stolen beef would drown under the noise of it. But we'd been watching for it, because Naya had said all along that a cornered Mercer would reach for fire. And we were ready in a way the band had never been ready before. Not because of me. I want that plain. But because the band's young men had spent 2 weeks learning that the white horsebreaker could read the Box M's mind. And the white horsebreaker had spent 2 weeks learning that the band's young men could ride circles around any soldier I'd ever scouted with. We'd made something together none of us could have made alone. There's a word for that. It took me years to be able to say it without my voice going. When Coy's riders came down on the camp with torches, the lodges they meant to burn were empty. The horses they meant to run off were already drifted up a draw under guard, and the band's men were waiting in the dark on every side. There was a deal of shouting and some shooting at shadows, and one of Coy's men got an arrow through the meat of his arm and another got dragged off his horse and sat on. But there was no killing. Naya had made that the iron law of it, no killing, because she knew a dead white man was the rope Mercer wanted to hang them all with. We took 6 of Mercer's men prisoner in the dark, including Del Coy, and we held them. And we held the torches they'd carried, pine knots soaked in coal oil hauled down from the Box M. And that coal oil came from 1 barrel, and that barrel had a freight mark on it. And that freight mark led straight back to Harlan Mercer's own account at the store. By sunup it was Mercer's men sitting tied in the band's camp, and Mercer's coal oil in evidence, and Tom Ash and 4 other ranchers riding in hard from the east because Martin had gone for them in the night, and the territorial marshal a day out and coming, sent for a week before by men who'd had enough. Mercer came down to the camp at mid-morning. He came alone because his men were taken, and he sat his big horse at the edge of the camp and looked at the wreck of his scheme. And for the first time I saw the hardy go out of him and the cold show through, the way the cold shows through a thin coat. "You," he said to me, "I should have buried you the night you left my whiskey sitting." "You should have," I agreed. He looked past me then to where Naya stood with her father and the band ranged behind them, the prisoners tied in the dust, his own coal oil stacked as evidence, and I watched him understand all at once that it was over, not the way he'd have ended it, the other way. "This isn't finished," he said, but his voice didn't believe it. "It's finished," Naya said. She stepped forward, and she was not a woman asking, she was a woman pronouncing. An old heavy cloud beside her let her speak for the band the way he'd always let her speak for the band because she was the best of them at it. "You stole our horses and our water, and you stole these men's cattle and called it ours. The marshal will have your books and your barrel and your buyer and these 6 men, who are already talking, because men like yours always talk. You won't move us. You'll be the one moved, Harlan Mercer, east, where they keep the men who steal. And the creek will run, and the children will get well, and you will be a story we tell to frighten no one, because you were never as large as you made the small men believe. I have heard a great many speeches in my life, in the army and out of it, from men paid to make them. I never heard one truer or one that landed harder." Mercer opened his mouth and shut it. Then he turned his big horse and rode out of that camp, and out of the basin near enough. For he was taken by the marshal within the month on Tom Ash's complaint and a dozen others, and the Box M was sold off piece by piece to the little men he'd been robbing, and the bottomland stayed the band's, with the creek running clean down the old channel. But that's the country's story, and the country's stories are never the ones that matter most. The one that matters most is smaller and slower, and I almost don't know how to tell it, being a plain man. So I'll tell it plain. Some evenings after Mercer was gone, when the basin had gone quiet again, and the cottonwoods had started to gold at the edges with the turning year. I was up at the corral working that buckskin gelding Naya's brother's horse, and Naya was on the rope rail watching, the way she'd watched that first evening, except everything between us had changed and neither of us had said a word about it, because saying things was not a thing we were good at, either of us. I finished the horse and turned him loose and came to the rail, and I stood there next to her with the creek talking and the light going long and gold across the bottomland, and I found I had a thing to say and no good way to say it. I had it figured, I said finally, that I'd ride on, end of summer. I always ride on. It's the one thing I'm good at besides horses. She didn't say anything. I find I don't want to, I said. Ride on. I find that's gone out of me. Like the war went out of me, only the other direction. There's a hole where the leaving used to be and I don't seem to be able to find it anymore. Still she didn't say anything, and I made myself look at her, and her face was open, and her eyes were wet at the corners the way they'd been at the buckskin's gentling, and she let me see it. My father says, she began and stopped and started over, which I'd never once heard her do. My father says a man who builds a fire of his own is a different thing than a man who only comes around one somebody else built. She turned to face me square. He told me to tell you that there is ground above the bend, good ground between our camp and the ford, that is neither one thing nor the other, and that a man could build a fire on it, if he meant to stay near it. I understood I was being given a thing far larger than ground. Naya, I said, I'm a white man with army blood on him and not much else, and your people have got every reason in the world to want my kind gone for good, and I wouldn't blame a one of them. I've got no right to ask you for anything. You haven't asked me for anything, she said. That's most of why I'm letting you. And then, because she could not let a tender thing stand without armoring it, also you are still too stupid to know what you want, so I have decided to know it for you. I am good at deciding. You've seen. I laughed and it came out cracked, and I reached out and took her hand, the one with the long white scar across the back of it, and she let me. And we stood there at the rope rail holding hands like two people who'd never held a hand before, which in the way that mattered we hadn't, and the buckskin came across the corral to us and put his nose over the rail between our shoulders, and we let him stand there, the three of us, in the gold light, while the creek that ran free went on talking to the country. I built the fire. We built it, I should say, because she'd never have stood for me saying I built anything alone, and she'd have been right. She was right about near everything. We raised a place on that ground above the bend, a cabin and a corral and a horse pasture along the running creek, and the band camped above us, and the ford lay below us, and we were, like the ground, neither one thing nor the other, and we made that not a hard place to be, but the best place I ever stood. Her father came to the joining. They have their own way of it, older and finer than any I'd known, and I'll not set it down here, for it was hers and her people's and not mine to spend in a story. I'll say only that Heavy Cloud, who had not liked me and had no reason to, stood and gave his word over us in front of his people, and what he said Naya told me after, lo, with her face against my shoulder. He said, this one came around our fire wanting something, as I told you, but he brought back what was stolen and asked for nothing. He stood in the water with us in the dark and broke the white man's dam with his own hands. He turned the white men's anger off our people and onto the man who earned it. And he gentled your brother's horse and gave it back to your hands and let his own go to hell, which were his words and which I have remembered. A man is known by what he does when no one is watching and what he asks for when everyone is. This one did much and asked for nothing. He may build his fire near ours. He has earned the ground. I have been called a great many things in my life, most of them by Naya, most of them deserved. But that earned the ground is the only thing anybody ever said about me that I have wanted carved somewhere when I'm gone. We grew old on that ground. The horses I gentled and the horses she gentled, and the horses our children gentled after us, for there were children, and they were neither one thing nor the other either, and they were the finest thing the two of us ever made together, finer than the cabin, finer than the herd, fine past my plain words to tell. They learned both tongues and both ways of sitting a horse and both ways of being still, and they were proud of all of it, and I was prouder of them than a man has any business being. The buckskin gelding lived to be old and gray-muzzled and died in our own pasture in the sun, and we buried him up the bend near where her brother lay, because she said her brother's hands had gentled him first, and his hands ought to be near him at the end, and mine had only borrowed him in between, and I held her while she said it and didn't argue, because she was right, the way she was always right. I rode that range 30 years and more after the war I'd thought had finished me. I came into that country a man with a hole in him where everything used to be, sworn off mattering, good for nothing but breaking horses and finding men for other men to kill. And a woman by a creek held a rifle on me and called me stupid, and would not let me die of my own foolishness because it would have been a waste, and slow, the way you gentle a scared horse, by stopping being one more thing it's frightened of and waiting while it learns that nothing bad happens when it stays. She let me into a life I had no right to and every reason to ride away from, and I stayed, and the hole filled up, and it was her, all of it, it was always her. They told me, when I first came into that basin, that the Painted Creek people trusted no white man, and that the woman who spoke for them trusted them least of anyone. They were right. She did. She trusted no man on his face or his color or his fine words, only on what he did and kept doing when no one was watching to praise him for it. And I am the proudest man who ever drew breath, that out of all the men who ever wanted something from her people's fire, I am the one she came in the end to trust, not because I was owed it, never that, but because I rode in one morning with 7 horses on a rope that were already hers, and gave them back, and asked for nothing, and then spent the rest of my life trying to be the kind of man a woman like that could decide, against all her hard-won wisdom and every reason in the world. To keep. She decided it. She was good at deciding. I never once told her she was wrong about that. It was the only thing I never told her in all our years, that, for once, the one time it mattered most, she might have been mistaken to choose me. I let it stand. A man learns, if he's lucky and patient, which of his wife's decisions to argue and which to be grateful for, silently, every day, until the day they put him in the ground up the bend near the brother and the buckskin, and by then near her too. That one I was grateful for. I am grateful for it still.